Picture this. You are at an auction house in London. The year is 2019. A small glass case is brought out and placed under the lights. Inside it, there is a brooch. It is delicate, almost beautiful, made with what appears to be extremely fine thread woven into an intricate floral pattern. The auctioneer describes it as a fine example of Victorian sentimental jewelry. The bidding starts. It goes higher than anyone expected, and then someone in the back row leans over to their companion and says very quietly, "You know that is made of human hair, right?" The companion stares at the brooch again, and something shifts. The delicate threads are still the same. The craftsmanship is still extraordinary. The object has not changed at all, but the person looking at it has, because there is something about knowing that changes everything about seeing. That brooch was made sometime in the 1860s. The hair inside it belonged to a child who died before the age of 2. The mother who commissioned it wore it every day for the rest of her life. And when she died, she was buried with it pinned to her dress. If your first reaction to that story is discomfort, that reaction is worth examining, because it tells you something important not about the Victorians, but about yourself. About the distance between your world and theirs. About how completely the meaning of objects, of death, of love and grief and the body, can change in the space of 150 years. Stay with me, because the real reason Victorians made jewelry from the hair of their dead is one of the most human stories you will ever hear. And if you are new here and you love history that makes you feel something real, subscribe right now, because we do this every single week. To understand Victorian mourning jewelry, you have to start with something that our world has almost completely eliminated and that the Victorian world was completely saturated with. You have to start with death itself. Not death as an abstract concept, or as something that happens to other people, or as something processed in hospitals behind closed doors and handed back to families in sealed containers. Death as a physical, present, intimate reality that happened in the home, that was witnessed by everyone in the household including the children, that left a body that the family washed and dressed and sat with for days before the burial. In the early Victorian period, the average life expectancy in England was approximately 40 years. That number is misleading in the same way that Victorian life expectancy numbers always are, because it is dragged down enormously by catastrophic infant and child mortality. If you survived to adulthood in Victorian England, your chances of living into your 50s and 60s were actually reasonable. But getting to adulthood was the hard part. Roughly 1 in 3 children born in Victorian England died before the age of 5. In the cities, in the overcrowded tenements where industrial workers lived without clean water or adequate sanitation, the mortality rates for infants were even higher. What this means in practical terms is that almost every Victorian family lost children, not as a statistical abstraction, but as a lived experience. Queen Victoria herself, who had 9 children, lost 2 of them before they were adults. Charles Dickens, who wrote about dead and dying children in practically every major novel he produced because dead and dying children were everywhere, lost children of his own. The carpenter in Leeds, the seamstress in Manchester, the banker in Bristol, all of them lived with the same statistical reality, that the children they loved might not survive. That grief was not an exceptional experience, but an ordinary one. That losing someone you loved was not a deviation from normal life, but a regular feature of it. This proximity to death changed how people related to the physical remains of the people they lost. And hair was at the center of that relationship in ways that are worth understanding carefully. Hair is extraordinary in its relationship to death. Unlike the body, which begins to decompose immediately after death, and which Victorian embalming technology could only partially slow, hair lasts essentially forever. A lock of hair cut from a person the day they die is, to all physical appearances, identical to a lock of hair cut from that same person while they were alive. It does not decay. It does not change color. It does not lose its texture or its smell, at least not immediately. In a world without photographs for most of the century, without audio recordings, without video, without any of the technologies we use today to preserve the presence of the people we love, hair was the most durable physical piece of a person that could be kept. The practice of keeping hair from the dead was not invented by the Victorians. It goes back centuries and can be found across cultures and throughout history. But the Victorians took this ancient practice and transformed it into something that had never existed before, a fully developed industry, an art form with its own techniques and aesthetics, a social ritual with its own elaborate codes and meanings, and a market that at its peak in the 1860s and 1870s supported thousands of specialized craftspeople across Britain and America. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what changed in the Victorian era that made mourning into a cultural institution on a scale that had never existed before. And the answer is partly about death itself, and partly about something that seems completely unrelated: the rise of the middle class. Before industrialization, mourning practices were largely determined by class in a simple and direct way. Aristocratic families had elaborate funeral traditions, mourning dress, and rituals that marked their status and their connection to dynastic continuity. Poor families buried their dead as quickly and cheaply as possible because they could not afford anything else. The emerging middle class of the early Victorian era, newly prosperous through commerce and industry, newly anxious about its social position and desperate to demonstrate respectability, created a demand for mourning practices that were simultaneously meaningful and visible. Practices that showed the world that this family grieved properly, that they understood the gravity of death, that they were the kind of people who took love and loss seriously. And Queen Victoria herself, more than any other single individual, shaped what those practices looked like. When Prince Albert died in December 1861, Victoria's grief was total, consuming, and completely public. She wore black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She kept Albert's clothes laid out, as if he might return. She had his shaving water brought to his room every morning for decades. She slept with a cast of his hand beside her. And she wore, every day until she died, jewelry made from his hair. The effect of Victoria's public grief on British and then American culture was extraordinary. When the most powerful woman in the world demonstrated that the appropriate response to loss was complete, visible, sustained, physical mourning, the culture followed. Mourning became not just a personal response to grief, but a social performance with explicit rules, correct durations, appropriate materials, and visible markers that told the world exactly where you were in the process of losing someone. The rules around Victorian mourning dress alone are complex enough to fill a book. For a widow, the first stage of mourning required wearing dull black fabric, specifically a fabric called parramatta that had almost no sheen, for a period of at least a year and a day. No jewelry except jet, which is a form of fossilized wood that is completely black, or jewelry made from the hair of the deceased. After the first year, a second stage of mourning allowed slightly less dull black fabrics. After 2 years, a gradual return to half mourning, which allowed gray, lavender, and white. The stages were different for different relationships. A widow mourned longer than a mother who had lost a child, who mourned longer than a sibling, who mourned longer than a cousin. These rules were not just social conventions in the sense of polite suggestions. They were enforced by social judgment of extraordinary severity. A widow who was seen wearing anything other than the prescribed mourning dress within the appropriate period was subjected to a social condemnation that could damage her reputation permanently. And conversely, a woman who wore her mourning correctly, who was seen to grieve visibly and properly, received a kind of social validation and sympathy that reinforced the practice. Within this system of mourning, hair jewelry occupied a special and deeply personal place. Because hair jewelry was not just a sign of mourning in the abstract. It was a piece of the actual person. When a Victorian woman wore a brooch made from her dead husband's hair or a bracelet woven from strands taken from her dead child's head, she was wearing something that had literally been part of that person's body. The intimacy of that was understood and valued in ways that are difficult to translate into modern terms, but that were completely legible to the people who practiced it. The techniques used to create Victorian hair jewelry were remarkably sophisticated. The most elaborate pieces were made by professional hair artists, craftspeople who specialized entirely in this art form and who advertised their services in newspapers and magazines. A customer would bring a quantity of hair, usually several ounces for a complex piece, and the hair artist would weave, braid, coil, and construct it into objects of real beauty. Brooches with intricate floral motifs, bracelets with woven patterns that required hundreds of individual strands, watch chains, rings, lockets with glass panels that revealed carefully arranged hair inside, earrings, pendants. The palette of human hair, which ranges from the palest blonde through every shade of brown and red to deep black, and which changes texture and color with age, gave hair artists material that was both consistent enough to work with and varied enough to create genuine visual complexity. A piece made from the hair of multiple family members who had died at different times might incorporate several different colors and textures, creating something that was simultaneously a work of art and a physical family archive. There were also amateur traditions of hair work that were practiced in the home. Books were published throughout the Victorian era with detailed instructions for creating hair jewelry without professional help. Magazines included patterns and techniques. Hair work was taught alongside embroidery and watercolor painting as one of the accomplishments that a properly educated young woman was expected to have. The domestic production of hair jewelry was woven into the fabric of middle-class female education in a way that made it absolutely ordinary, absolutely expected, absolutely unremarkable. Except that from the outside, from our perspective looking back, it is anything but unremarkable. And the question of why our reaction to it is so different from theirs gets to the heart of something important about how cultures construct the boundary between the acceptable and the disturbing. In our world, the body after death has been professionalized almost completely out of sight. People die in hospitals or hospices. Funeral homes take the body and prepare it using processes that most families never witness. The physical remains are handled by professionals wearing gloves who maintain a clinical distance that is simultaneously practical and symbolic. The body of someone you loved after death is handled by strangers so that you do not have to handle it yourself. This is presented as a kindness, as protection, as the appropriate modern way of managing the transition from the presence of a person to their absence. What this system actually does, whatever its intentions, is remove the physical reality of death from ordinary experience. It means that most people today have never touched a dead body, never washed one, never sat in a room with one for 3 days, never cut hair from one. Death happens behind closed doors and comes back to you as ashes in a box or as a made-up face in a coffin that you look at briefly before the lid is closed. The Victorians had none of this distance. Death happened in the home. The body stayed in the home. The family participated in every stage of preparation and keeping, and the hair that was cut from the body was not a strange or transgressive act. It was a natural part of a process of physical farewell that was intimate, present, and entirely normal. Understanding this does not require approving of it or disapproving of it. It requires recognizing that the line between what feels normal and what feels disturbing is not a line drawn by nature. It is a line drawn by culture, and it moves. There is another dimension to Victorian hair jewelry that is often overlooked in favor of the more dramatic mourning context, and that is its use among the living. Not all hair jewelry was made from the dead. A significant portion of it was made from the hair of living people who were loved and who were far away. In the 19th century, before telephones, before affordable photography, before any of the technologies that make the people we love feel present even when they are distant, the physical absence of someone you loved was total. A soldier who left for a posting in India might not be seen again for 3 years. A daughter who married and moved to another city might visit once a year. An immigrant who left for America was, for practical purposes, gone forever. In this context, a lock of hair given to someone you loved before a long separation was not a morbid gesture. It was a piece of you that could travel with them, a physical proof of connection that could be held, worn, looked at, something that made the abstract fact of love into a concrete, touchable object. Lovers exchanged hair. Parents kept hair from their children's first haircuts not because they anticipated death, but because childhood passes and the physical evidence of it does not last. Friends who expected to be separated by circumstance exchanged hair as tokens of their friendship that would endure the distance. The language of Victorian hair exchange, which was elaborate and codified and deeply serious, was the language of love and connection expressed through the most intimate material of the body. This context changes the mourning jewelry significantly. When a Victorian woman wore a brooch made from her child's hair, she was participating in a practice that she had also engaged in when that child was alive, when the child was healthy, when the hair was cut in a moment of joy or tenderness rather than grief. The continuity between giving hair in life and keeping hair in death was natural within a culture where hair was already understood as a medium of intimate connection. By the 1880s and 1890s, the practice was beginning to decline. The reasons are multiple and interconnected. The introduction of affordable photography, which gave people a different kind of physical memento of the people they loved, reduced one of the primary functions of hair jewelry. The gradual professionalization of death and the emergence of the modern funeral industry began to create the distance between the living and the dead that we now take for granted. Changing fashion sensibilities in the late Victorian period moved away from the heavy, symbolic, meaning-laden aesthetics of mid-Victorian design toward lighter, more abstract decorative forms. And the gradual relaxation of the strict mourning codes, which had always been criticized by reformers as excessive and as placing an unfair financial burden on families of modest means, reduced the social pressure to express grief through specific material forms. By the time Edward VII came to the throne in 1901 and the Victorian era officially ended, hair jewelry was already beginning to feel old-fashioned. By the time the First World War had killed an entire generation of young men and forced Britain into a confrontation with mass death on a scale that made the Victorian rituals of individual mourning feel inadequate and almost quaint, it had largely disappeared from everyday life. Today, Victorian hair jewelry survives primarily in museums and in the collections of antique dealers and private collectors. The pieces that remain are almost universally beautiful in a technical sense. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The materials are perfectly preserved, and they carry with them a weight, a presence, a quality of meaning that most antique objects do not have. Because when you look at a Victorian hair brooch in a museum case, you are not looking at an abstract artifact. You are looking at something that was made from a specific person's body and worn by someone who loved that person so much that they needed to keep something physical, something real, something that could be touched and held and worn against the skin. You are looking at grief made tangible, at love made into an object, at the human refusal to let the people we lose become entirely abstract, entirely past, entirely gone. The Victorians were not macabre. They were not in love with death in some pathological way. They were people who lived in close proximity to loss, who had not yet developed the cultural mechanisms to put death at a distance, and who found ways to carry their grief that were physical and visible and unembarrassed. Ways that said to the world, I loved this person. They were real. Their body was real. And I am not going to pretend that losing them is something I can process privately and then set aside. There is something in that we might consider, not as a model to return to, but as a reminder that the way we handle grief today, the privatization of loss, the professional management of death, the expectation that mourning should be discreet and time-limited and kept out of the way of the normal business of life, is not the only way, is not necessarily the best way, is a cultural choice, like all cultural choices, with costs that we do not always name. The next time you see a piece of Victorian hair jewelry in a museum or in an antique shop, look at it again. Look at the craftsmanship. Look at the delicacy of the work. And then remember that somewhere inside that beautiful object is a piece of someone who was loved. Someone whose absence was real enough and painful enough that the person who lost them needed to make it into something they could hold. That is not disturbing. That is one of the most human things you will ever see. If this video made you think about something differently, that is exactly what we are here for. Subscribe if you have not already, because every week we go this deep into the stories that history usually tells wrong or does not tell at all. And share this with someone who thinks they already know everything about the Victorians, because I promise you they do not. See you in the next one.